Hello, welcome to Podsongs. I'm Jack Stafford, and I interview inspiring people in service to others as inspiration for a new song. I want to apologize to you for missing our appointment last week due to some unforeseen technical difficulties, workflow problems really, in that, as you know, I'm based in the south of Italy. It's our first summer working together, and I didn't realize just how hot it gets. And my producer, Maurizio Sarnicola, was not available to do the mixing. I had a backlog of episodes ready to go, but I've burnt through them before he's back online. So not to worry, we're back in the studio in September, and we've got about 50 interviews and songs packed up ready to go. So we'll get there in the end. We'll get back to our normal routine. So today's guest is Gregg Caruso. He's a professor of philosophy at SUNY Corning and co-director of the Justice Without Retribution Network at the University of Aberdeen. We're going to be talking about free will. His research focuses on free will, moral responsibility, punishment, law, prison system, moral philosophy. His books include Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment and Criminal Justice, and Debating Free Will and Consciousness. We're going to discuss whether we have free will, basically. And I'm joined on the interview by Nate Frederick, who's a country singer in Nashville. Now, he was going to sing the song, but unfortunately, as it's probably going to work out quite a few times that the singers are not available to do it in the end, it just didn't work out due to time commitment. So he's just joined me for the interview. So don't be surprised when you hear my dulcet tones singing the song at the end. So without further ado, please welcome Gregg Caruso. So thanks for joining us, Gregg. It's great.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
It was actually Nate. It was Nate here who wants to play quarterback on this interview.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Because I tried to read your books, but there's one leg I have the book and the other one the dictionary.
Okay. Yeah. It could be tough.
So that's the good thing about doing a podcast, though, is I can ask stupid questions that I'm pretending I'm asking for the audience, really. But actually,
that's great.
Yeah.
So we can really do baby steps.
No problem. I don't mind.
Let me first.
I was hoping that you'd have on the circular green glasses.
Yeah.
Those are awesome.
They're actually my reading glasses, which I often wear when I'm at the computer, but I still have the green ones.
Well,
those are awesome. What a great look.
Thanks.
Well, let me introduce Nate here, who's in Missouri now, but he's a Nashville songwriter.
Yeah, I saw your website. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Congratulations on the album.
So I hope.
Thank you so much.
I hope you like country, Gregg.
Yeah.
All right, great, because it's going to be a country song.
Yeah. Well, maybe it could just be it could be a smooth jazz song.
It's going to be.
I feel like smooth jazz goes with a good, bigger words also, or thought provoking. Maybe not bigger. It can be a short word, but you have to look it up.
Yeah. Good.
I love retributivism. Is that how you say it?
Retribution or retributivism. Yeah.
Retributivism. Okay, there you go. Perfect.
What?
That's awesome.
What rhymes with retributivism?
That's a hard one. I don't know. I'm not the songwriter.
Oh gosh, it's almost like you have to take two words and put them together. Like give him. Like you'd have to end it with give him. Like what was she gonna give him?
All right.
The retributivism.
He's working already here, Gregg. He's
he's
a machine. We're in good hands.
Yeah.
He's a machine.
All right, so let's give him some inspiration here. Let's get started. So you've just written this book that's right behind you, Just Desserts, where you debated with someone much more intelligent than us about philosophy. Maybe you could just slide us in there, because free will. I think everyone understands free will, but you're a free will skeptic. So can you just introduce us to this whole subject?
Yeah, so, the issue of free will is a kind of perennial philosophical question that's been debated for probably at least 2,000 years, going back to the ancient Greeks. The reason I think it's such an interesting and important question is it touches on, at least the way that I approach the problem, it touches on a number of real practical aspects of our interpersonal relationships, our public policies, our attitudes towards others. And so usually the issue of free will is believed to have connection with questions about moral responsibility. And in particular, whether we have the kind of free will that would ground blaming and punishing individuals, i.e. holding them morally responsible in the way that they would truly deserve to be praised for their good acts and truly deserve to be blamed or punished, for their bad acts. So the title of the book is called Just Desserts, not to confuse with deserts or what we have after dinner. But the notion of just desserts is the punishment that one deserves.
Everybody kind of has a story. So everyone does certain things that compel them to be where they're at that other people won't understand. So how could you even understand what would be the correct thing to do to those people? Like the right reparations for something. If you don't even know what compelled them to actually do it, how can you make the decision that this is, the punishment fits a crime? For that.
Well, right. So that actually is sort of the motivation from my view. So I'm a free will skeptic, and as a free will skeptic, I sort of maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of that, we're never morally responsible in a very particular sense, what I call the basic desert sense. Yeah. So the basic desert sense of moral responsibility is the sense that would make one truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward, simply for having committed the act, not looking at potential, forward-looking benefits of praise or blame. So for me, I think that, the fact that how we make decisions, the kind of people we are, the kinds of reasons that move us are shaped by factors beyond our control, whether that's determinism, that the universe is deterministic, or even I talk about luck quite often, how luck can undermine. So, the lottery of life isn't always fair. We don't all have equal starting points. And so some of us are born into poverty. Some of us are born into abusive families. Some of us are born into low socioeconomic situations. Some of us are born into war-torn regions of the world. And so I find it very hard to morally blame, like if you take a real life issue, right? Like if I threw you in Darfur or Rwanda into the circumstances that those individuals are born into a war-torn country where at age 12, you have a machine gun shoved in your hand and you're told to jump on the back of this pickup truck and come kill this other clan, or join their side and try to kill us, or remain neutral and be killed in the crossfire, or have your wife and sister and daughter mutilated. Are you capable of? And so what I would suggest is that we have to look at the circumstances in which people are embedded, and the approach I would take to sort of preventing crime and to dealing with violent behavior is to focus more on prevention and social justice issues. That is, the underlying causes that give rise to crime, rather than viewing things at the level of individual responsibility, where all we ever do is take a punitive approach, which is a punishment-based approach. And we say, we want an eye for an eye, we want retribution. And that's, so the kind of free will I deny is exactly the kind of free will that would be needed to justify what's called retributive justice, retributive punishment. So retributive justifications of punishment maintain that absent any excusing conditions, like a mental illness or something, wrongdoers are morally responsible and they need to be given their just deserts. They justly deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done. And so that notion is a kind of notion that plays a big role in our thinking. It plays a big role, I think, in political attitudes about crime and punishment. It also plays a big role in religious thinking when you talk about eternal damnation and eternal reward, that you're to be rewarded or punished, eternal salvation or eternal damnation. But I would argue that if determinism is true, if indeterminism is true, or the pervasiveness of luck is so broad that it swallows all, that we need to reconsider our attitudes about this kind of moral responsibility. I mean, there are other kinds of moral responsibility, I think, that could be preserved, even if we reject free will. But I define free will, by the way, as the control and action that's needed for this kind of basic desert moral responsibility, where individuals, deserve to be praised or blamed in a basic sense, meaning in a sense that's purely backward looking and doesn't talk about future benefits. So like the retributive, I'll give you an example, maybe this helps. There's a very famous retributivist named Immanuel Kant, this famous German philosopher. And he says, imagine this island where there's a society and they're gonna disband themselves. They're all gonna leave the island. They're gonna break up their social contract and all the members are gonna scatter around the planet. But there's one remaining murderer in jail. And Kant asks, would we be justified in executing that murderer before we left the island? And Kant, being a retributivist, says not only would we be justified, we would be required to execute that person. And you have to think about why for the retributivist. It's not to protect society. There's no one left to protect. Everyone's gone. It's not to deter crime. There's no one left to deter. It's not to help in the moral improvement of the individual because you're killing them. The sole reason you would be executing this individual for Kant is to give them their just deserts, to give them the punishment they deserve. And because they committed murder, Kant thinks the only just punishment would be death. I would argue that there are alternatives to retributive punishment that we could adopt that could protect society from dangerous criminals, but that we should give up on the notion of just deserts, give up on the notion of basic desert moral responsibility, and give up the notion of free will, and instead look more clearly at the causes that shape individuals and the circumstances that lead to crime, that lead to criminality. So instead of blaming people at the tail end, we have to look at the situation, what I call the social determinants of behavior, the social determinants of crime, and try to address those to prevent these outcomes from occurring in the first place. Of course, on the tail end, I owe you a story of what to do with serial killers and stuff, which I could go into. But.
Well, I mean, it's almost like when you're blaming someone for how, like if you're in an argument with someone, for instance, the way that I'm taking what you're saying, and they say, this is how I feel. Yeah. This is the emotion that I have. You can't blame them for how they feel. You can't tell them that how they feel is necessarily wrong, more so than ask the questions how you got there. I mean, and you can't, I think the only free will that we really have as people is our perspective. I mean, our perspective is what creates happiness or success in anyone's life, no matter where you're at. If you're Kim Kardashian, having a pimple on your face is just as probably emotionally distressing some of the things that happen in third world countries.
Yeah.
Because her perspective, it is
you can't control,
skewed.
Yeah, you can't control people's emotional reactions. And, even if I was wronged in like an intimate personal relationship, I'll probably feel anger towards that person who harmed me,
right,
or my loved one. But I can reflect philosophically upon those kind of reactions and ask whether or not I think they're justified. And one thing that could help, I think, alleviate the immediate, what I call like the strike back emotion. We have this really strong desire to strike back when someone wrongs us. It's a very retributive impulse, I think. But one way to soften it, I think, is sometimes to consider things philosophically having to do with the arguments against free will, which I haven't really got to. But also, I think the luck one is a powerful one. So like, there's a book, just to use an example, there's a book called The Two Wes Moores. And it's not a fiction book. It's written by this guy. I don't know if you know Wes Moore. He's sometimes on TV as a talking head or something. He's an African-American who grew up in Chicago in an inner city. And there was literally another guy in his town called Wes Moore. So there were two people with the same name. And what he does in the book is trace the two different outcomes. The one guy, his fellow person, the person who was named Wes Moore, gets into gangs, gets into drugs, and then goes in and out of jail. The Wes Moore who wrote the book ends up joining the military, rising in the ranks, and then he became a policy advocate and has a really successful career. But he talks about how easily he could have been the other Wes Moore, right? And little things can really account for those difference in outcome, right? Like like one thing about luck that's really interesting is two people can engage in the same action and yet have two different outcomes. So let's say me and you both drink a case of beer and decide to drive home from the bar. We did the same exact thing. And a person jumps out in the road and I swerve and I don't hit him. You swerve and you accidentally hit him. Well, that's a matter of luck. But your whole life course is changed and affected by that outcome of luck. Whereas we engage in exactly the same acts and, had two totally different results. And sometimes, it's just a matter of, who intervenes in your life. Did you have a helpful teacher, an encouraging parent? Did you have a good role model? Did someone from the military come and speak at your school? Did someone at the right moment when you were receptive to influence affect you to act in a different way? But that's not something you ultimately control. Those are really factors of luck. And if yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like on the scenario, good or bad luck, where things just are. Things just happen. And depending on how you intake them and output them is the only thing that you can control. And so luck may exist, but good luck and bad luck is something that we perceive.
I read in your biography,
things just happen.
I read in your biography, Nate, that you were running from the police and you fell off a cliff, and it took you a year to recover, and you learned to play the guitar because of that.
So that would have been bad luck. That would have been bad luck that then turned into good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way,
like maybe you
so it's right. So So I mean, your free will comes after the fact, not of what happens to you, but how you perceive it, your perspective that has brought you there. Sometimes inside of something bad gives you perspective because you're able to appreciate things that you wouldn't, otherwise. But actually, like the actions that's where your free will only comes after the fact of something that's happened to you.
Well, as a free will skeptic, I would rather call that something else than free will, only because I think that free will is too wrapped up in our attitudes of just desserts and more responsibility and retributivism. So I would say, look, one could be influenced by causal factors. Like, let's say I can't control. I eat chocolate all the time. I can't control my cravings, right? And one day I go join Chocoholics Anonymous and I get control of my chocolate cravings, and now I don't eat chocolate. Well, one thing I might ask is, where did that desire, follow this, the desire to stop desiring chocolate come from? And I would argue that itself had some kind of prior causal antecedent. Like maybe my wife commented about my weight. Maybe my doctor said I have to cut back on my cholesterol. Maybe I read something in the newspaper. So there's this kind of causal feedback loop where our actions have consequences, and then our consequences act as new causes that then change the weights inside our psychology. So now I start desiring not to eat chocolate more than I desire the chocolate. But I don't really control the weights of those scales. I simply react to the weights of those scales, right? Like, so let's say, I use this example in class. Like, let's say I come in and I ridicule you. I say, oh, look, you got a 30 on the exam. What a fool. And now you're sort of embarrassed, and then I keep on riding you. And then eventually you punch me in the face, right? And then the question would be, like, you could look at this from the external perspective and the internal perspective. From the external perspective, you don't control other people's reactions. You can't control my dickiness, right? Like, you can't control me, laughing at you, ridiculing. So let's say you have no control over that. Well, now let's look on the internal level. Do you control embarrassment? Well, not really. That's something you just have. Different people will have different thresholds of embarrassment given their life experiences, right? Like, if I were to, and you probably as well, if you were asked to get on a stage, you wouldn't probably have much resistance. But you ask my wife to step on a stage and she's going to immediately turn beet red, right? And that's because different experiences throughout life have shaped our embarrassment. But then I would argue you don't really control the threshold at which embarrassment turns to anger, right? Like that itself is shaped by factors beyond your control. Whether your parents were patient with you as a kid, whether there was a lot of screaming in your home, whether you resolved conflicts in various ways in your past. And then I would argue you don't control the threshold at which anger turns the action, right? Some people get cut off on the highway and they go on with their day. Some people follow you to your driveway and beat you with a bat, right? Like some people just fly off. Now, here's the part where you're talking about. Let's say you punch me and then you get expelled, or your wife or girlfriend leaves you because you can't control your anger, or you get fired from your job. Now, those are consequences, and they feed back as a kind of new influence. So maybe you say, look, I got to get control of my anger. I go join anger management courses, and I now learn techniques to control my anger. I wouldn't call that free will. I would say that the consequences of your actions shifted your internal scales so that you began to realize that these emotional flights off, of anger are causing detrimental effects in your lives. And then those scales started to shift so that you felt like you needed to get help more than you felt like you wanted to succumb to your anger. But that itself was determined by factors beyond your control.
Can I just come in here then? I think
Yeah.
Can I just go back to the bit about retributory justice? Because people argue against retributory justice without even bringing free will into the argument. Even if someone deliberately did that, they still deserve the rehabilitation, and they should be. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that there are many reasons why we might want to reject retributive punishment and retributive justice. You don't have to be a free will skeptic to think that there are problems with retributive justice. I have another book coming out called Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will Punishment, Criminal Justice. And I developed 6 arguments for rejecting retributivism in that book. Only 2 of them have to do with free will. The other 4 have nothing to do with free will. So that's fine. But what I wanted to do was come up with an alternative approach to criminal behavior that was consistent with free will skepticism.
So what is why are you on this path? Let's go the bigger picture, because you have, as a philosopher, you could take many different stances. You could have Schopenhauer on the other side, or you have another Kant on the. You've got an array of a smorgasbord of arguments. Why are you pushing this argument and writing about it?
It's an interesting question. Again, can't psychoanalyze myself. I've been interested in the issue of free will since graduate school, and my first book was a book against free will, and then people started asking me about what I thought about policy issues and what the implications of my view were, and I started to really work more and more on those, and I got really particularly interested in criminal justice. And so my most recent book is really a book on criminal justice. And now I'm co-director of a network called the Justice Without Retribution Network. And what I've partly done, and what part of the things that motivate me is both my family. I have 6 older brothers. 2 of them had drug issues, addiction issues. And I often think about, and they're now doing very well, and they've rehabilitated themselves. But I also think about the fact that how different their lives could have gone if luck had just gone the other way in a couple small instances. Right? They could be dead. They could be in prison. And also I think about the social justice aspect, that being white and having a supportive family, I think often led to different outcomes than people who find themselves incarcerated, who didn't have the luck of a family who could hire a lawyer or, provide support for them financially when they couldn't support themselves. So those issues really motivated. And I think a lot about the issue of mass incarceration. So you think about the fact that United States is only about 4.5% of the world's population. So we're actually a really small portion of the overall population of the planet, only about 4.5%. Yet United States houses 25% of the world's prisoners. That is the highest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No other society in the history of mankind has ever imprisoned that many members of their society. Oh. So we imprison 700 people for every 100,000 people. Where you think about Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, where they imprison about 60 people for every 100,000. We literally imprison over 10 times as many people as these other nations. And 1 in every 31 Americans, just think about that, 1 in every 31 Americans is somewhere within the criminal justice system. Parole, probation, imprisonment, jail, federal or state, they're somewhere in that criminal justice net, 1 out of 31. Wow. And so one of the things I've tried to do is see where my free will skepticism leads me, and then think about how we could better approach these issues. So what I've come up with is something I call the public health quarantine model. So the public health quarantine model has a quarantine component, what I call, and I'll explain that, and then a public health component. So let me go with the quarantine analogy first. Let's say I come to talk with you guys, or I come to Nashville to visit you in person. And on the way, I contract Ebola, right? I'm at the airport. They test me. I test positive for Ebola. I think we'd all agree that the state is morally justified in quarantining me, right? And their justification for quarantine would be something like the right of self-defense or prevention of harm to society, i.e. you would quarantine me to prevent this communicable disease from, turning into a pandemic, right? And the justification for quarantine would not have to appeal to free will, wouldn't appeal to blame or retributivism or just desserts. You're not giving this person their just desserts. You're not saying they deserve to be punished, but you are justified in limiting their liberty. And now I would argue that when it comes to seriously dangerous criminals like, child molesters or serial killers, we could justify incapacitation, restricting their liberty on the grounds of the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we give for quarantine. So we could say that, look, we can incapacitate the seriously dangerous criminal without appealing to free will, without appealing to basic desert moral responsibility, without appealing to just desserts or retribution or even punishment. Because I don't think under any standard definition of punishment do we punish the Ebola patient when we quarantine them. But note, if you do this, if you adopt this model, a couple really important reforms follow. So just like you quarantine me at the airport, but the story doesn't end there. You have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer a threat, right? Because you lack the justification for holding me any longer than is necessary to protect public health. So I would argue that the criminal justice system would have to reorient itself to rehabilitation and reintegration, and that the primary purpose should be to reintegrate individuals back into society as quickly as possible. I also argue that you would have to adopt what I call the principle of least restriction. You would have to adopt the least restrictive measure necessary that's consistent with protecting public safety. So if there's some alternative to incarceration that could just as easily protect people in society, I would argue you have to opt for that option before incapacitation. And so what I've done in the book is I actually go through very carefully and look at the statistics. Over 50% of people in prisons in the United States suffer from a diagnosable mental illness. Most of them would be better served with mental health services. In fact, our jails have become de facto mental health institutions, which they're not designed for. Many of them, vast majority of them, have underlying addiction problems. They would probably be better served with drug treatment. In fact, I actually argue that my model is consistent with the decriminalization of many things we currently incarcerate people for. So low-level offenses, personal possession of marijuana, those kind of things for me don't present a public threat to the level that would constitute incapacitation. So just like think of the quarantine analogy. If I have a common cold and I sneeze on you and you get sick, I've caused you some harm. But we don't quarantine people with the common cold. And that's because we accept a certain amount of risk in society and we deem certain threats as acceptable threats. We think that they would be better served with less restrictive measures. But Ebola or COVID, we think that those are significant enough threats that maybe quarantine is warranted in certain special situations.
So why is America the leader in this? What is it, because of the way the statute is written, or is it other?
Yeah. So what I would argue is that excessively retributive society. And I think it does tie back to the free will issue, because I think people tend to see crime very much like they see poverty as an issue of individual responsibility. We blame those in poverty for their own circumstances. We blame it on laziness or they didn't work hard enough. And we blame crime on individual responsibility rather than looking at it as systemic and being driven. So I've actually done a lot of work, empirical work here, where I've identified what I call the social determinants of crime. And I've argued that the social determinants of crime are essentially analogous to the social determinants of health. So when you think about like poor health outcomes, type 2 diabetes, infant mortality rates, why children don't survive childbirth, or early adolescence. What you'll often find is the main drivers for those poor health outcomes are things like poverty, low socioeconomic status, lack of stable housing, lack of access to health care, lack of good nutrition, mental health issues, environmental health, housing, and abuse. And what I've found is incarceration rates actually are correlated exactly with those things as well. Poverty is the greatest correlate, the greatest determinant of incarceration. Think about this, 90% of women in prison, over 90% of the women who are incarcerated right now have been victims of violence in the past. Domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse. So think about that you can't get much closer a correlation than 90%, right? And so if you want to prevent women from being incarcerated, the best thing is to prevent them from being victimized in the first place. And the reason why it's such a connection between violence is either the criminal act is a response to their abuser, or it's at the behest of their abuser. They're in an abusive relationship, maybe with codependency and drugs, and they engage in petty crimes forced by their abuser. Or more than likely, a lot of times what we find is women that have been abused end up having mental health issues, and they end up incurring higher rates of unemployment. They can't hold a steady job because they were victimized. And because they don't have a steady source of income, they resort to petty crime. So yes, they committed a criminal act, but is it really an issue of individual responsibility where we want to, it's kind of like double jeopardy. They got screwed in the lottery of life, and now we're screwing them again by punishing them or blaming them for circumstances that they were already victimized by. So what I would argue is like, look, you still have to deal with serial killers and protect society, which we could do with the quarantine analogy, but we should shift the focus to prevention and social justice. And that's where the public health part comes in, because public health institutions have been in place for many years and have been dealing with these social determinants. So treat crime like we treat pandemics, treat violence like we treat disease, track its causes, and then address those social determinants. So think about like infant mortality rates in India. One of the reasons why there's higher rates of death in childbirth is usually because of an underlying social inequality. It has to do with women's rights primarily. Lower literacy among women, so they tend to have more children and less of them survive. They tend to not have reproductive control over their bodies. They tend to lack access to birth control. So to improve the better health outcome, you have to address the social injustice. And so what I would argue is criminal justice reform can't be done without simultaneously addressing issues of social justice, racism, sexism, inequality, poverty, the things that essentially drive crime. Sorry, I'm talking so much, but I'll just add to this one more thing. I think that why America is resistant to this is I think that, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you think of all of this as an issue of individual responsibility, your response is always a punitive one, a punishment-based approach to crime. But one of the big differences between, say, the United States and, say, Norway is not only that they incarcerate far less people than we do, but they have one of the lowest rates of recidivism in the world, which is repeat crime. So they have about a 20% rate of recidivism. We have nearly a 70% rate of recidivism. That is, nearly 70% of people will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. And one of the main reasons is that we treat our prisons as punitive forms of punishment. They're designed as punishment, not for rehabilitation. So you come in, you're stripped naked, you're dehumanized. Every aspect of your life is controlled. When you eat, when you go to sleep, when you move, right? And then we release you and say, okay, now be a model citizen. Well, we haven't improved your life in any way. We haven't given you any work training, any education. We haven't, addressed any underlying mental health issues or addiction issues. And ultimately, our outcome is far worse for it. But the reason, I think, is that people see crime as the byproduct of broken people, bad people. And the right response to that is to just punish them, not help them. I'll just add two more things, if that's okay, real quick. One thing is that, one way to change people's attitudes is to show them that it's in their self-interest. So, for example, educational programs in prison. people resist it because they're like, I can't even afford to send my kid to college. Taxpayers are going to pay for criminals to go to prison for free. But if you explain to them that it makes us safer. So this one program actually showed that it reduced recidivism by nearly 50%, just providing college education, cut it in half. Second, it saves us money. For every dollar we spend on educational programs in prison, we save $5. And that's because incarceration costs a lot of money, paying to house people. Crime costs a lot in terms of property loss and damage. Courts cost a lot. So if you could prevent it from occurring, it actually is, more humane and more effective, but it also saves us money. Basically $5 for every dollar spent. The only other thing I'll mention is something I've worked on that comes from social psychology. This gets us a little into other things, but there's been evidence that the belief in free will corresponds with something called the belief in a just world, or just world belief. And I'm not making this up. There's in psychology, there's a scale for measuring how much people buy into the just world belief. They give them these statements and they judge how much they agree or disagree. And based on whether their agreement, we could tell whether they have a very strong belief in a just world or a very weak belief. Now, think of the belief in a just world on the surface sounds perfectly fine. It says the world is just and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Right. But it actually tends to be a rather dangerous belief because it tends to result in a blame of the victim approach. So I'll give you an example. One of the greatest examples is rape victims, right? Rape is a horrific thing. And in a just world, it wouldn't happen to someone who didn't deserve it, right? Because good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So what happens in the courtroom is the defense attorney will blame the victim. They were dressed provocatively or walking where they shouldn't be walking, or they were intoxicated and it was their fault. And the reason they do it is it works. And the reason it works is that the jury, they don't, not consciously, but unconsciously, to preserve the belief in a just world, you have to somehow make the victim deserving of what happened to them. So to preserve the belief in a just world, you have to make individuals responsible. And now you can see how the belief in free will correlates, because people who are in poverty somehow deserve to be in poverty. Because in a just world, people who are impoverished, good people or hardworking people wouldn't be poor.
Because it still has to fall within their theory. And if not, It blows a hole in their whole theory. And then, so you're not asking them really just to blame this individual person. You're asking them to rethink their entire beliefs.
Yeah.
So they're willing to be like, oh, well, okay, that's why, So it's not really that they're thinking that of the person. You're challenging them on a much higher level to realize that
what they call cognitive dissonance. You're challenging essentially one of their core beliefs. So, I think Ronald Reagan had a very famous quote that kind of represents this. He said something very close to, whenever a crime occurs, we have to stop blaming society and make people personally responsible for their actions. And this was the beginning of the tough on crime era, when public policy became more and more punitive and mass incarceration really took off. Now, there's a sense in which that statement is not too bad, but there's another sense in which, which I think it when you have a myopic focus with punishment and you're focused on giving people their just desserts, you tend to be blind to the things that cause the underlying behavior in the first. And so what I'm trying to do is to look at what actually causes human behavior, and then try to say that the best way to produce better outcomes in society is to equal the playing field, to address the social injustices, to adopt programs of prevention, just like we do for disease and public health, you would do for violence. So they actually did this in Scotland. They took a public health approach to crime in Scotland, because at one point Glasgow was the murder capital of Europe. And they had one of the highest rates of stabbings in the world. In particular, facial cut, like gangs that were attacking people with knives and machetes and things like this. And they employed this program, and it ended up cutting violent stabbings and violent crimes in half within the first 5 years. And one of the things they did is they tried to identify the main causes. And they identified things like alcohol consumption, which is pretty built into the culture of Scottish society. Unemployment rates were really high. And what they considered toxic masculinity, images of settling conflicts with violence, right? And they started doing a number of small things, like bringing programs into high schools to teach them about the effects of gang membership and stabbings, and to have public service announcements addressing toxic masculinity. They brought in educational and work training programs to address unemployment. They also started to address it in ERs and every interface people have with. So if you come in with a stabbing, they not only, because most victims are also perpetrators, they're involved in the culture of violence. And what they did is they looked at the institutions, the individuals holistically. And they said, okay, you came in with a stabbing, but what are some of the underlying issues in your life? And they would often find they have unstable housing. They can't afford to pay rent. Or they didn't have transportation to get to their work. Or there were just causes in their lives that were causing them to resort in petty crime. And they took a holistic approach, hooking them up to social services, putting them in contact with different agencies that could help them. And these small little steps actually cut the crime rate in half within 5 years.
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah.
So when I was getting you on the show, I was really into free will. I was ready to argue about that, but really now I understand you're driving social change. You're like a prison reformer, and so that's fantastic.
Yeah.
You've really looked at the bigger picture of the underlying cause is people's values, and that's fantastic. So we definitely have to help you with a song here.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many. I mean, this is how I take notes here. But I've got so many good, solid things here. I think this is going to be a very introspective song. I really enjoyed this conversation a lot so far, and I like that you're just shedding light on. I know that you do obviously have one side that you believe.
Yeah.
But you're,
does it resonate with you, Nate? Do you know people in the prison system?
It does. I don't really know people in the prison system, but I do understand, especially in the industry that I'm in, how much what you do is out of your control.
Yeah.
From a luck standpoint, I'm in a subjective industry.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways,
person in the audience on the right night.
I've watched it happen. I've watched it happen time and time and time again. And you get into the point of just controlling your own controllables.
Yeah.
But it's the world is that way, and you're blanketing a problem with how you want to see the world as opposed to how the world actually really is.
Yeah.
So
I'll give you another analogy of that too. I mean, music is probably the clearest, because it isn't necessarily talent. You could have two people of equal talent. One gets the break and the other doesn't for reasons beyond their control. But there was a book by Malcolm Gladwell, this very famous New York Times writer, where he found some weird anomaly, like a piece of paper or something. But he found this weird thing where professional hockey players,
is that what it's called? Yep, hockey players.
They all fell in,
and they were all younger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was this weird thing where overwhelming number of them clustered birthdays. Let's just say January and December. I can't remember the exact 2 months. And he said it's way beyond statistical chance. How could this be? And the explanation he discovered was that most of them come from Canada. Most of them are put in the Pee-wee leagues at 4 or 5, the minute they could start walking. And what he discovered was the cutoff for whether you would be the oldest in the league or the youngest was based on your birthday. And if you were born in these 2 months, you were the oldest in that league. Now think about it, 4 or 5. Developmentally, you're nearly like a year older than the kid on the skates next to you. And that has a huge impact on your abilities. Not because you're more gifted or more talented, but because you're a year older nearly. And so you have better hand-eye coordination. You're literally larger. I mean, if you look at a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, there's a big difference developmentally. So they do better. And so the next stage up, maybe they put on a better team. Maybe they get better coaching. Maybe eventually they're put into an elite league with better facilities and better training and tougher competition. And over time, this small inequality, which is just based on a contingency of birth, what month you're born in, you don't choose that. That's luck. It turns out that it has a big impact on whether you succeed in getting into the professional hockey league. Now, occasionally, some July guy will get in, but he has to overcome more hurdles than the person who just happened to be born at the peak of that curve.
So that is the point.
Yeah.
The hurdles, so maybe I've made sense of it in my own mind, but I believe that the hurdles are the gift, because then that gives you back to where we started perspective. And I think that if good things happen to you, it's great. Your life is easier, but you don't really have much more appreciation. And I think that's maybe the only universal beauty. And maybe we don't have free will, but I think that there is a gift inside of adversity sometimes.
As long as it's something that one could end up benefiting from. There's certain kinds of adversity that, unfortunately can't overcome. Yeah.
I mean, and maybe that's challenging my overall, outlook anyway, to be like, well, maybe there isn't a silver lining to everything.
Yeah.
We want to think that there is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the belief in a just world too, is that we want to believe that good will come we might have lost him. I don't know.
Oh, well, I could just join in now. I was thinking, because I'm a firm believer in free will, but I think we have a very weak will, and we think our culture's thoughts. Where if you put me in Rwanda, or you put me, you're the average of the 5 people with whom you spend most of the time. So 90% of our thoughts we think are coming from outside. So we're in a classroom, and we're here to learn, but our free will is very weak. But there is at the very core of it, we do have free will. Is my chip in.
Yeah. I guess it depends on, then it's a matter of what kind of account you have for free will. So what I try to do is, as I argue that free will skepticism is the only rational position to adopt, because all of the different approaches to preserving free will suffer from one or another type of failure. And so I go through libertarian accounts of free will, compatibilist accounts. So I don't know what kind of free will you believe in.
Well, I mean, you're a reaction to this terrible situation now with the prison population. And so you have to take this stance to hold up a mirror to society and say, listen, the way you're judging your brothers all around you is based on this idea. Do you really think that, or are you just thinking that your culture's thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, another good example, I don't know if you remember, Obama gave this crazy speech several years ago when he was president, where he was in front of a successful business crowd, and he made this statement that if you succeeded in business, you didn't build it yourself. And somehow the Republican Party went really crazy over that quote. And the convention that year, it was a presidential election year, they ran the whole convention around the slogan, "Yes, we did." Like, yes, we did. We built it ourselves. And I wondered, why was there such a reaction to that claim? And if you listen to the next sentence Obama said, it was sort of innocuously true statement. He just said, if you succeeded in business or in life in general, you probably had some help along the way, a good teacher, an encouraging parent. And yet I think there's a certain kind of culture in the United States, the kind of pick yourself up from the bootstraps culture, that wants to make every aspect of my success my own doing. And the flip side of that is every aspect of someone else's failures, poverty, crime, must be a moral failure that they're responsible for. Where I think both our successes and our failures are often driven by factors just beyond our control. Now, I agree with Jake that you have to also be able to learn from one's experiences, turn bad experiences into good, but you also have to have the ability to do that. And that still requires some luck. the kind of luck that you can actually be the kind of person that learns from that bad experience, and so I would say whether or not you're that kind of person or not is often a byproduct of factors beyond your control.
Can I just go back to karma, because I agree with you, and I've heard a lot of spiritual people as well who, because I'm a firm believer in the law of karma, but even spiritual people say, yeah, well, it's from their past lives or it's affecting them. But
I think that could be dangerous, because I
just say that because it's about that, because we're in a classroom, we're here to learn, and by helping these people, helping anyone, we tremendously improve our own karma.
Oh yeah, I mean I agree with that you put good into the world and good comes back. But I also think that belief in a just world can be dangerous. So there's a really crazy example of this. There was, I think she was the head of education policy during the Reagan years. She made a comment about students with Down syndrome and somehow made this kind of comment that they were somehow responsible for that themselves, if not because what they did in this life, what they did in a previous life, kind of argument. And I find that a relatively dangerous kind of use of that idea, that we got to the point where even people with genetic disorders who literally have no control over their genes, right, are somehow being blamed for having some kind of disorder and somehow deserve it. That's a part of the view that troubles me.
It's an opportunity to serve. The more people there are with problems, the more opportunities we have to serve. So, yeah. All right. Well, I'm super inspired. How about you, Nate?
I totally. It's such an overarching question that you don't have to, maybe you don't have to know the answer to it as much as you do that, in your own life moving forward, all you can control is,
We lost him again.
We lost him.
I think he was just about to capture the essence of what you were saying.
Yeah,
but we'll let him do that in the song. So
I appreciate
it's been great.
Yeah, this has been fun.
I really, really admire what you're doing, and like as I said before, just to repeat it, that I love people who, look at society and say, see what contribution I can make, and how can I influence? Because as individuals, we all want to make a difference, and
that's the.
So are you lecturing on this in prisons and politicians? You're lobbying.
Yeah. I was just zoomed into a prison the other day to education program to talk to their students. I just got an email this morning from the person who's the head of policy for the Democratic Alliance Party in South Africa, which I guess is the opposition party. And they're really influenced on my work, criminal justice, want to talk to me to influence their policy platform.
Fantastic. So what, if we were going to sum it up in a song, what area would you, of your work, if you could boil it down to the essence, do you have like a motto or what's the nub of it?
I guess the two aspects are the free will skepticism and the crime and punishment part. As a skeptic, I think that, again, who we are and what we do is ultimately result of factors beyond our control. And because of that, we should reject retributivism and seek more humane, more effective, policies.
And is there a quote on your wall that you have about that, or some super inspiring phrase that?
I wish I could give you one right off the top of my head.
I'll Google it. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well, let me know how it goes. So what happens next? You guys try to write?
Yeah, well, I'm in Italy. Nate's in Nashville, so no problem.
Oh no, that's
sorry, gents. I'm sorry that keeps kicking me out of there. Yeah, my point was going to be that you just, everybody has, you can't really control anybody, but you're. I don't know. This is making me think. I don't know that this is challenging a lot for me, and that's a good thing. That
well, third time a charm. He's much more. He's going to be a great song anyway. He's going to sum it all up.
Yeah, thanks. Send it to me.
I will do. Done. Thanks very much. It's been great chatting to you, Gregg.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye.
Careful of the friends you have. Remember
Remember, you can choose. You may not like their attitudes, but in time you'll share their views. Everything gets passed around from attributes to vice. If you accept their company, you'll soon take their advice. Soon take their advice. Whoa, man, you are the average of the 5 people with whom you spend most of the time. You are the average. You only know what you've been taught. You think your culture's thoughts. You look around the place you work with an expression of disgust at people who you'll never be. There's no one you can trust. But take a look from a little bit up, you already look the same. You're blending in quite perfectly. You fit inside the frame. You fit inside the frame. Oh man, you are the average of the 5 people with whom you spend most of the time. You are the average. You only know what you've been taught. You think your culture's thoughts. Even your ambition, what you want from life, can be enabled or destroyed by your husband or your wife. Your friends can help you be a better person or lead you on the path to sin. You might think you can rise above it, but in time you will sink in. In time you will sink in. Oh man, you are the average of the 5 people with whom you spend most of the time. You are the average. You only know what you've been taught. You think your culture's thoughts. Well, thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed that. You can check it out on Spotify, Deezer, iTunes. It'll be released in a couple of weeks there. And I want to thank the musicians. It was actually a band this time, Stragati, who played with me. Sorry Nate didn't get to do it. Check out his music though, it's great. Nate Frederick on Spotify, or just Google him. So, and also thanks to my researcher Dori Verbo. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with a friend. Thanks very much. See you next time.